Welcome to the Global WarWatch Network. What exactly is NATO? I mean, as Russia's war in Ukraine rages on, we see the alliance expanding, strengthening its military presence in Europe.
Yeah.
But is NATO just, a defensive pact? Or is it something far bigger? This really is a critical topic for understanding our world right now. Global security, economic stability, they're intertwined in ways what we haven't seen in decades, and making sense of these complex dynamics is just more important than ever.
That's absolutely right. And our mission today really is to explore NATO's evolution. From its Cold War origins right up to its current role, we'll look at the tensions around its expansion, and crucially, how Russia's actions have profoundly reshaped not just European security, but also the entire landscape of global oil geopolitics. We're going to be distilling insights from some really comprehensive sources, a Council on Foreign Relations backgrounder on NATO, a detailed webinar on the geopolitics of oil. The goal is to give you a clear, sort of nuanced understanding of these interconnected global challenges.
Okay, let's unpack this then. We hear about NATO constantly, especially now. But what's its foundational identity? What's the core idea, holding it all together?
Well, at its core, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, it was set up back in 1949, a transatlantic security alliance. Its original purpose, really, was as a bulwark against Soviet aggression. That was the direct response to the post-World War II landscape.
Right.
Today, it comprises 32 member countries, including, of course, the United States.
And what's the absolute sort of non-negotiable principle, the one thing that really defines NATO?
That would have to be Article V of the North Atlantic Treaty. It's foundational. It famously states that an armed attack against one or more member states shall be considered an attack against them all.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly. That's the bedrock of collective defense, unequivocally.
That's a huge commitment. Has that ever actually been, put into practice beyond just theory?
It has, yes, though only once so far. The first and only time Article Z was formally invoked was after the 9/11 terrorist attacks on the U.S.
And that wasn't just a military response. It really shifted NATO's identity, didn't it? From a regional defense pact to, arguably, a global counterterrorism force. That move still sparks debate, about its core purpose.
Interesting. And how does it actually operate day to day?
Well, it's headquartered in Brussels. It functions as a consensus-based alliance, which means it needs unanimous decisions. Big choices need everyone on board.
Right, consensus.
And it has a robust military and civilian structure. Key commands in Europe, also in the U.S. Political decisions are guided by the Secretary General, currently Mark Rutte, who chairs the North Atlantic Council. And an interesting detail, the Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, the top military job, is always a U.S. officer.
Right.
That tells you something about the alliance's leadership structure.
So it's a mutual defense club, potentially global reach now. But who pays for it all? And how has that changed, especially with all the recent global pressures? Yeah, the funding is multifaceted. Member states contribute mainly by deploying their own armed forces, and those costs are typically covered by their national budgets. The formal NATO budget, which funds alliance infrastructure, things like headquarters, it's relatively modest, about $5.3 billion in 2025. But the real discussion, the one you hear about, is defense spending overall. There's that target, agreed back in 2014, for members to spend 2% of their GDP on defense.
Right, the 2% target. That's been contentious.
Hugely. For years, many members fell short. But Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine, well, that sparked a significant shift, a dramatic one, really. In 2021, only 6 members met that target. By 2024, that number jumped to 23 out of 32.
Wow. That's a big jump. But the U.S. still plays a disproportionately large role in that spending, right?
It does, yeah. Traditionally, the U.S. shoulders a very large portion. It accounted for roughly 64% of NATO's collective defense spending in 2024.
64%.
Yeah. And that massive financial commitment, it's not just dollars and cents. It's politically complex. It gives the U.S. significant influence, obviously. But it also makes it a constant target for criticism about burden sharing, especially when, domestic political winds shift in the U.S.
Like we saw with former President Trump.
Exactly. We saw that very clearly with his assertive approach. He suggested re-examining treaty obligations, even called for members to increase contributions to 5% of GDP in a potential second term. That's 3.5% core defense. 1.5% defense-related spending.
5%. That's a huge jump from 2. Are we seeing real concrete changes from key members in response to these pressures and, the war?
Absolutely. Take Germany. Historically, a very cautious spender. Following Russia's 2022 invasion, they pledged 100 billion euros for weapons investments, and they confirmed in January 2025 that they had exceeded that 2% threshold. That's a major policy shift for one of Europe's biggest economies. And what's really fascinating here, I think, is how NATO's mission itself evolved, especially after the Cold War ended, and how that evolution, well, it directly fueled tensions with Russia. The alliance has been anything but static.
Yeah, it's captivating to think about. NATO was designed for one era, the Cold War, and then suddenly the Soviet Union collapses in 91. Had to completely redefine itself.
What were the big internal debates about its new direction, its purpose, without that original adversary?
That's a crucial point. After 1991, Western leaders, they debated intensely about NATO's future. Initially, within the Clinton administration, there was actually opposition to expanding eastward.
Yeah, mainly to avoid upsetting Russia's, fragile government at the time. But that position soon pivoted. The administration started advocating for membership expansion, seeing it as a way to extend security, consolidate democratic gains across post-Soviet Europe.
Okay.
And as a kind of intermediary step, partly to try and allay Russian concerns, they introduced the Partnership for Peace in 1994. That was a non-membership framework aimed at increasing cooperation with former Warsaw Pact members.
But the alliance also started looking beyond just collective defense within its own borders, didn't it? It wasn't just about expanding who was in the club.
Precisely. Many U.S. officials believed a post-Cold War NATO had to confront challenges outside its traditional borders. Senator Richard Lugar, he famously said back in '93, the common denominator of all the new security problems in Europe is that they all lie beyond NATO's current borders.
So acting out of area.
Exactly. And this shift led directly to NATO's first combat operations in its entire history. That was April 1994, during the conflict in Yugoslavia. Specifically, a bombing campaign on Bosnian Serb forces that was, pretty crucial to ending that conflict.
And then after 9/11, it went truly global with Afghanistan. That fundamentally shifted its identity, didn't it?
Indeed. The mission in Afghanistan following 9/11 and the invocation Article V, that saw NATO contribute over 130,000 troops at its peak from 50 alliance and partner countries.
Wow.
It was a 20-year operation, lasted until 2021, and it really signaled NATO's adaptation, to the post-Cold War security environment. Later in 2011, NATO also played a role in Libya, policing a UN-sanctioned no-fly zone. Although it's worth remembering, individual states or subgroups within the alliance can act outside NATO's official command. That's why Germany and Poland, for example, declined to contribute directly to the Libya campaign.
So NATO broadened its scope. Some saw that as necessary for the changing world. But Moscow definitely saw this differently. They were not happy about this expansion, viewing it as a direct threat aimed at them.
You're absolutely correct. Moscow has consistently and very vocally viewed NATO's post-Cold War expansion into Central and Eastern Europe with great concern. They see it as a betrayal of alleged U.S. guarantees, supposedly made after German reunification in 1990, that NATO wouldn't expand eastward. Now, U.S. officials involved back then dispute that claim, but the perception in Moscow is powerful.
A classic security dilemma, then.
Exactly. Secretary of State Warren Christopher even articulated this risk way back in 1994. He said, swift expansion of NATO eastward could make a neo-imperialist Russia a self-fulfilling prophecy.
It sounds like there was just this persistent lack of trust, a constant problem, even with attempts at reconciliation. Were there credible arguments even from Western voices back then that might have predicted this friction?
Oh, certainly. Even within the West, some strategists questioned the wisdom of pushing eastward too aggressively. They feared it would isolate and antagonize Russia unnecessarily. But as you say, despite steps like the 1997 Founding Act, which created an official forum for bilateral talks, that deep lack of trust just plagued relations. And that distrust just escalated with a series of, provocations, depending on your perspective.
Yeah.
At the 2008 Bucharest summit, for instance, NATO vowed to support Georgia and Ukraine's eventual membership. This was despite Russia's explicit warnings against it.
And then Russia invaded Georgia that same summer.
Precisely. A clear, chilling signal of its perceived red lines. Then later, 2014, Russia's annexation of Crimea and its destabilization of eastern Ukraine, that led NATO to suspend all civilian and military cooperation with Moscow.
And these tensions, they really came to a head, didn't they, leading directly to the current war?
They did. It all culminated in late 2021, early 2022. Putin demanded a permanent halt to NATO expansion, Russian consent for any deployments near its borders, removal of U.S. nuclear weapons from Europe, Alliance leaders dismissed these demands, considered them non-starters, and that led directly to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And if we connect this now to the bigger picture, Russia's actions in Ukraine have, without a doubt, renewed and reshaped the alliance. But they've also triggered this seismic shift in global energy. It's really a dual transformation we're watching, where military strategy and energy security are just deeply intertwined.
Okay, so the war pushes NATO to react. What does a renewed alliance actually look like on the ground? What concrete steps has NATO taken to, bolster its defenses and support its members, especially those on the eastern flank?
The response has been pretty robust. NATO has significantly reinforced that eastern flank. They've ramped up military exercises, established new command centers across several key Eastern European members: Bulgaria, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia.
Right across the board.
Exactly. They've also created a new rapid reaction force. About 20,000 troops initially, could potentially swell to 40,000 in a major crisis. There are multinational battle groups rotating through the Baltic states and Poland. That started back in 2017. And defenses in the Black Sea region have been bolstered with a new multinational force in Romania. Air patrols have increased significantly today, too. Jets routinely scrambled to intercept Russian warplanes testing airspace.
And what about Ukraine's relationship with NATO during all this? They're not a member, obviously, but they're absolutely central to the crisis.
Right. Ukraine remains outside NATO's Article V defense perimeter because it's not a member, but their relationship has deepened considerably. In the years leading up to the invasion, Ukraine held annual military exercises with NATO. They gained status as an enhanced opportunity partner. Kyiv still affirms its goal for full NATO membership, although, many experts deem that unlikely while the conflict is ongoing. But importantly, NATO member countries, individually and in groups, including the U.S., have provided just unprecedented levels of military support to Ukraine: tanks, heavy artillery, drones, vital anti-aircraft systems. But this aid is given outside formal alliance auspices. NATO leaders have been very careful to avoid actions, like imposing a no-fly zone, that could directly draw the alliance into conflict with Russia, despite, Russian rhetoric about potential escalation, even nuclear war.
So, a strong response, but also a cautious one, trying not to escalate directly. What about U.S. support and any internal divides within NATO, especially with, a shifting political landscape in the U.S. and elsewhere?
That's where things get more complex, certainly. Since former President Trump's return to office in January 2025, we've seen the U.S. soften its support for Ukraine somewhat, temporarily pausing some military aid, reportedly pushing Kyiv towards concessions for a ceasefire.
Right, that was big news.
Yeah. At the Munich Security Conference back in February, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, he essentially dismissed Ukraine's NATO accession hopes and ruled out a U.S.-led peacekeeping mission. That's a significant policy shift. Strategically, maybe it's an attempt to de-escalate. Maybe it reflects shifting domestic priorities in the U.S.
Interesting.
And these shifts coincide with some existing internal NATO divides. Hungary and Slovakia, for instance, they've expressed opposition to Ukraine's membership, often due to historical ties, economic dependence on Russia, or just a fear of escalation. And adding to that, former President Trump suggested back in March 2025 that the U.S. wouldn't necessarily defend members who weren't contributing enough to defense spending. That raises direct questions about the Article V collective defense commitment itself.
Yet, despite all these challenges, these internal debates, we've also seen NATO expand since the invasion started, which seems quite paradoxical.
It really is a paradox. Russia's actions, perhaps counterintuitively, spurred another major expansion. Finland joined in April 2023. That dramatically expanded NATO's Nordic footprint and doubled its border length with Russia.
Huge strategic shift.
Massive. And Sweden followed in March 2024. This was a direct response from historically neutral countries to perceived Russian aggression, reinforcing NATO's core defense mission. And looking ahead, the 2025 Hague Summit, coming up June 24th to 26th, is expected to focus on defense spending, continued support for Ukraine. President Zelensky's invited and reportedly approved a huge 400% increase to NATO's air and missile defenses.
So the war definitely forced NATO's hand, strengthened its core, even expanded its membership despite the internal pressures. But the economic ripple effects, they're equally profound, especially in the world of energy. Russia's actions haven't just redrawn military maps, they've fundamentally rewired global energy markets. This feels like a second front in the whole geopolitical struggle. Let's pivot now to the really intricate geopolitics of oil and what this means for you, the listener.
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial to understand just how interconnected the global energy system is. I mean, the world consumes over 100 million barrels of oil every single day.
Wow.
And this vast quantity has to be constantly moved, supplied. There's really no country, developed or emerging, that escapes the need for oil for its national security, its economic stability. And Russia, being one of the top 3 global producers right up there with the US and Saudi Arabia, its 2022 reinvasion of Ukraine just profoundly upended oil geopolitics. It caused this significant reshaping or remapping of supply chains, and it brought energy security, oil security, right back to the forefront of international concerns.
And that had immediate effects on prices, didn't it? I definitely remember the volatility back then.
Oh, absolutely. The April 2023 decision by OPEC Plus, and remember, OPEC Plus now includes non-OPEC producers like Russia, Kazakhstan, Mexico, alongside traditional OPEC members like Saudi Arabia. Their decision to cut production by 1.2 million barrels a day came at a time when supply was already tight. This caused an immediate uptick in prices. They stabilized eventually around, say, $80 plus per barrel, but it fueled energy inflation and really hit vulnerable economies hard. The U.S. openly expressed disappointment with that decision, which just highlights the political calculations constantly at play.
But despite sanctions, despite international pressure, Russia is still selling its oil, isn't it? That seems like a major challenge to the whole sanctions regime.
That's one of the most striking aspects, yes. Russia is still moving oil. Its overall production and exports have at times been as high or even higher than pre-invasion levels.
How are they managing that?
Well, new buyers have stepped in. Turkey, Singapore, China, India, often purchasing discounted Russian oil. Russia has employed so-called shadow tankers, ships operating outside normal registries, and utilized pipelines like the East Siberian pipeline directly to China to bypass sanctions. A long-term concern, though, is the lack of Western investment in Russia's energy infrastructure that could impact their future production capacity down the line. And what's also clear is that global oil demand is actually expanding, not reducing. Much of this growth is coming from Asia, particularly China and India. China's reopening after COVID created uncertainty for demand forecasts, potentially increasing pressure on global supply. And Africa also expects higher demand as its economies grow.
So energy security, which you defined as adequate supply at affordable prices.
Yeah.
That remains a massive challenge when global demand is increasing and supply is subject to all these geopolitical pressures.
Exactly. Any reduction in supply, especially in tight markets, inevitably leads to higher prices. And that has significant impacts on vulnerable economies, global inflation. Which brings us right to this inherent tension between the push for an energy transition and current, very real demand. Despite the Paris Agreement back in 2015, the world still consumes over 100 million barrels a day.
And when will that peak? That's the big question.
It's hotly contested. Some forecasts say peak demand is before 2030, others say well after. Partly because oil consumption isn't just about cars and planes. It extends far beyond transportation into vital sectors like petrochemicals, fertilizers, things that are much harder to decarbonize quickly.
Are oil companies doing anything to address the emissions side of this while demand stays so high?
Well, many oil and gas companies are working to reduce emissions from their production processes, things like carbon capture technologies, reducing flaring. Some countries, notably Saudi Arabia, are even trying to market low-emission oil as a potential differentiator.
Interesting concept.
Meanwhile, in Europe, Russia's weaponization of natural gas after the invasion definitely accelerated their push for renewables and for industrial competition in clean energy tech, mirroring things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. But Europe still relies on gas from Algeria, Norway, U.S. LNG, that's liquefied natural gas.
And even some Russian LNG, ironically.
And even increased LNG imports from Russia, yes. So the transition is quickening, but it's complex. It's interesting, too, that the EU's green taxonomy, basically their list of sustainable economic activities, it includes both nuclear and natural gas, acknowledging their role, at least for now, as transitional fuels.
Given all these complexities, what about the U.S. relationship with a key oil player like Saudi Arabia, especially with those OPEC plus cuts creating global ripples?
Yeah, U.S.-Saudi relations have been, let's say, tense for the last decade or so. And this has definitely been exacerbated by Saudi Arabia's policy of non-alignment regarding Russia and Ukraine, and by those OPEC plus production cuts. The old oil for security relationship established post-WWII has shifted significantly. The U.S. shale revolution made America less dependent on Middle Eastern oil imports.
Right, the U.S. is a major producer itself now.
Exactly. And the U.S. has used its own strategic petroleum reserves, notably releasing a huge 180 million barrels in 2022, specifically to try and cushion American consumers from price spikes caused by this market instability.
It sounds like the supply picture is just incredibly complex, incredibly politically charged, But ultimately, who really holds the most sway? Who controls these vast oil resources globally? Is it the big international companies we hear about?
That's a crucial point for understanding oil geopolitics. Over 75%, three-quarters of the world's oil is actually controlled by state-owned oil companies, known as NOCs.
NOCs, like Saudi Aramco.
Like Saudi Aramco, yes, or PDVSA in Venezuela. These huge entities are often driven primarily by state budget concerns, by national strategic interests. Their decision-making is fundamentally different from privately owned international oil companies like ExxonMobil or Shell. This concentration of control in state hands gives governments immense power over global supply and prices. So what does all this mean for you grappling with these really complex global dynamics? Maybe consider this. The way military alliances and energy security are tangled up together, something laid bare by the Ukraine conflict, it reveals a fundamental paradox, doesn't it? Nations are striving for energy independence, for greener futures, yet the immediate, overwhelming demand for traditional energy sources remains immense.
Mm.
And that often forces uncomfortable geopolitical compromises, awkward alliances. The question really is, how long can this tension between immediate energy needs and those longer-term security and climate goals, how long can it be sustained? And what will be the true cost, ultimately, of navigating this incredibly complex transition?
That's a powerful thought to end on. And that's all the time we have for this exploration of NATO and the geopolitics of oil. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, really delving into these critical global issues. If you found this discussion insightful and you want to stay informed on global events, please do like this episode, share with others who might benefit, and definitely subscribe to the Global WarWatch Network. We also really invite you to share your thoughts in the comment section below. What stood out to you? What questions does this raise for you? And don't forget to join us on social media. All the links for that are provided in the description. Your engagement truly helps us continue to bring you these essential conversations. Until next time, stay curious and stay informed.